Hello everyone, I'll go over the round 3 game from the US Championship played by Fabiano, Caruana and Jeffery Xiong, and round 3 brought much less excitement than the previous rounds. Wesley So and Varuzian Akobian drew their games, they were the leaders before round 3, and Fabiano Caruana, who was in second place, caught up with them now. So after round 3, Akobian, Wesley So and Caruana are sharing first place. In this game, Jeffery Xiong had the white pieces. He opened with pawn to d4, and we have knight to f6, knight to f3, e6, c4, c5, and now this is the Blumenfeld counter gambit, not the Benoni defense yet because of e6. And now d5, d6, knight to c3, e takes d5 is the best move. This is now already the Benoni structure. C takes d5 and g6. They now enter the classical Benoni defense. From this position on, the main move for white is e4, and this would be the classical variation after bishop to g7, bishop e2 and both sides castling. But after g2, Jeffery Xiong went for bishop to f4, which is the second most common move. And this is now immediately putting pressure on the weak d6 pawn, the weakest point in the Benoni structure for black, and the pawn that actually made the Benoni defense less popular in the last 20 or 30 years, and it's considered slightly dubious for black. Now bishop to g7, preparing to castle kingside. The most common move would be a6 and not bishop to g7, and after a4, bishop to g7 then, but it can often transpose. So bishop to g7, and from this position on, Jeffery Xiong also makes a deviation. The best move is queen to a4, and after bishop d7, queen b3, pressurizing b7, and queen to c7. And after that, white would normally strike in the center with e4, reinforcing his structure. But after bishop to g7, Jeffery Xiong played e3, which is slightly passive, but that's another way to play the position. And now black has already equalized. Now black castles and h3. This is a waste of time and not a good move, because the only thing it does, it's preventing the knight from entering the g4 square, but that isn't really a threat yet. The best move was to develop the bishop to e2 and prepare castling. And now Caruana returns the favor. He plays a mistake himself, queen to e7, centralizing the queen. But the best move was knight to a6, and after bishop to c4, reinforcing the d5 pawn, knight to c7, rerouting the knight to put pressure on the d5 pawn. And now a4, and the game would continue like this. But after queen to e7, black doesn't have such a common plan to develop his queenside, and he's slower to centralize all of his pieces. Now Xiong plays a mistake himself, once again, knight to d2. This is not such a common idea, and it would have been more useful had the knight been on e4 already, had the pawn been on e4 already. And that's a common plan because you want to put your knight on c4 and pressurize d6, but in this position with the pawn on e3 it doesn't really work. Now knight to h5 by Caruana. This is another reason why h3 was played, to make sure the bishop can return, because if the pawn is on e4, the bishop can go back. Now it can't, of course. So now bishop to h2, but now Caruana gains momentum, and he has two free tempi to play and to push on the kingside, expanding and gaining space, and he does that immediately with f5, pressurizing Xiong's kingside. And now bishop to e2, preparing to castle, and f4. And in this position you can see that black already has a lot of pressure. Of course, it's nothing major, it's not an advantage, the position is equal, but practically speaking black has more attacking chances because he's faster to open up the king side, and of course black's king is already safe while white's king is still on e1. And then another major factor is the strong Benoni bishop on g7, striking along the entire board. And here I would just like to point out that taking the knight and ruining black's pawn structure is not really a threat, because after bishop takes h5, f takes e3, black can even afford to offer a piece to white temporarily. Of course, if the bishop retreats, then e takes d2 is winning, and after king to f1 you can see that black has a completely dominant position. And if the bishop doesn't retreat, if white captures the pawn, then queen captures, so it doesn't really work. So in this position after f4, Jeffery Xiong castled, allowing f takes e3. And now once again, if he takes with f takes e3, then queen e3, king to h1, you can see that black has a dominant position. So after f takes e3, Jeffery Xiong played knight d to e4, this way disrupting the defense of the e3 pawn by the queen. And now from this position, of course, Caruana should capture the f2 pawn to make sure it's not taken for nothing. So e takes f2, and here Jeffery Xiong makes a mistake. The best move was rook f2, and after rook f2, knight f2. That's the point of knight to e4, but after e takes f2 check, he played king to h1. And now we can see that Caruana is temporarily 2 pawns up, and Jeffery Xiong will have to work really hard to regain those pawns actually, and it's never a good idea to go material down against Fabiano Caruana, who is too strong to make sure you would allow that to him. So, okay, the f7, the f2 pawn can be regained easily, but the other pawn not that much. From this position on, Caruana actually plays a great move, a move which I'm sure not many people would think of. He gave up his dark squared bishop. He played bishop takes c3, and the point of that is, of course, the bishop can't be taken with the pawn because the knight is loose. The queen would take. So after knight takes c3, he relieved some of the pressure from f7, and this now gives him time to reroute his pieces. Of course, he doesn't want to allow bishop takes h5 in this position because, first of all, that would ruin his structure, open up his king, and also lose a pawn. So knight to g7, bishop to f3, now once again putting more pressure on f7, disrupting the defense by the rook. Now knight to d7, preparing to enter the e5 square, and that would be strategically almost winning for black. Black now has an advantage. Rook f2, and now knight to e5. And of course, if bishop takes, queen could take now, so, and of course the knight is much stronger than the bishop, so the bishop should take. But first, Jeffery Xiong plays rook to e2, putting even more pressure, and now knight to f5, preparing to jump into g3. And now bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and d6. This is actually another pawn sacrifice by Jeffery Xiong, but he has to make some room for his pieces along this diagonal to at least pressurize the king for being material down. Now Caruana takes, knight d6, queen to d5 check, and now simply knight to f7, defending e5 and covering the check at the same time. Of course, that drops the c5 pawn, but that doesn't really matter. Knight to e4, attacking c5, and now of course b6 can't be played because the rook is hanging. The queen will take, so rook to b8, and now queen to c5, queen takes c5, knight takes c5, and you can see from this position that Caruana is still a clear pawn up. Okay, there is a lot of pressure on b7 and on e5, but the pawns are actually easily defended, and even if black returns one pawn, he will have a dominant position for allowing white to lose a couple of tempi to regain the material. Now he plays b6, dislodging the knight, knight to e4, bishop to f5, pressurizing the knight, knight to c3, and now rook b to d8, a4, a5 closing down the position, bishop to d5 pinning the knight, rook f to e8 to make sure that the pawn is still defended, bishop f7, king f7, and now rook to f1 pinning the bishop. And of course now g4 is a threat, that would lose a piece, so king to e6, and now the king is coming to the center, which is the best idea in this position. Of course, if the king can defend the e5 pawn, then it relieves the rooks from their duty of defending, and it's also unpinning the bishop. Now rook f to e1, doubling the pressure, king to f6, and now a repetition, because Caruana would rather stay on the king side with the king than go to the queen side, but he concedes after all. Rook f1, king e6, rook f to e1, king d6, now he goes to the queen side, and now rook to e3. And now already black has such a strong position that there isn't really anything white can do to defend this position. Of course, the bishop is much stronger than the knight. It's controlling a lot of key squares along the center and on the diagonals, and the knight is the knight doesn't have that much scope. Of course, being a pawn up is another major factor, and the fact that the extra pawn is the passed e5 pawn, which can easily advance up the board if white doesn't want to make his pieces even more passive. That makes black's position very dominant. Now king to c6, anticipating the check on b5, knight to b5 anyway, rook to e7, preparing to double rooks, and now g4. The best move from this position was rook to c1, checking the king, but you might be wondering why not just take the pawn on e5, because it's hanging now. But that would give black too much play and too much initiative. If rook takes e5, rook takes e5, rook takes c5, and rook to d2 would simply win the b2 pawn, and then after that win the a4 pawn, and there is no way for white to defend that and to hold the position. And of course the bishop is perfectly placed to prevent the rook from checking from e6. So this wouldn't be good. He played g4 instead, which isn't that good anyway. Bishop to d3. Of course the rook is defending. Knight to c3. bishop to c4, now stopping b3, defending a4, rook to c1, pinning the bishop to the king indirectly, so king to b7, rook to e4, attacking the bishop, and now rook to d4, offering a trade, and of course that would advance the pawn one square further up the board, dislodge the knight, and the bishop could easily be defended with a move such as b5, and after a takes, bishop takes, the position would be great for white. So he plays king to g1, trying to centralize, but this is too slow. Now bishop to b3, preventing the rook from coming to d1, king to f2, and now rook to d2 check. This is either trading pieces or winning the b2 pawn. So now after rook to e2, rook f7 check, putting even more pressure, king to e3, rook to d4, now knight to b5, attacking the rook, rook d to d7, and you can see that white, even though it's only one pawn down, the bishop is so much better than the knight that the knight just stands no chance. It can't defend the a4 pawn, and if another pawn drops, then black's pawns will be unstoppable. For now, of course, one extra pawn can be blockaded somehow, even though the e5 pawn is providing two outposts for the rook, so if at any point rook e4 is played or king e4, then the pieces can be dislodged. Now Jeffery Xiong tries knight to c3, rook to f4, attacking a4 twice, rook to d2, rook f to d4, offering a trade, rook to f2, and now bishop takes f4, grabbing the second pawn, rook to f6, that doesn't really do anything, and after bishop to c6, Jeffery Xiong resigned, he gave up, and this is a clear material advantage, 2 pawns up, and what's even worse, white doesn't have a way to prevent the rooks from being traded off if he wants to stay in the game, and if he trades rooks, then he is out of the game anyway, because 2 pawns is too much of an advantage. So a great game by Fabiano Caruana, I would say. A slightly uncommon opening. I'm not sure that he's played the Benoni that often. Perhaps he was trying to get young Jeffery Xiong out of his preparation and prove that he is a worthy contender for the World Championship title, and that he can diversify his opening repertoire even more. So definitely a worthy win. And what's even more important, he caught up with Akobian and Wesley So, who were in clear first because they drew their games yesterday. So now he's sharing first place. And judging by the Grenke Chess Classic and the Candidates Tournament, I'm not sure there will be anybody who can stop him from winning this event as well. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for watching. I would just like to apologize for the background noises. There's construction in my neighborhood once again, and stay tuned for more chess. I will be covering more games from the US Championship. I will be covering some games by Bobby Fischer and making more theoretical videos on the Caro-Kann. Thanks very much. Bye.